A chill ran down his spine. It was an unseasonably cold morning in early spring, the streets mostly empty, as he jogged past an alleyway that looked old enough to have been around for decades. It wasn't an area of town he usually frequented, but today felt different. That's when he saw it. A weathered cardboard box propped next to a stuffed garbage dumpster. It was smeared with dirt, its corners ragged and wet with the morning dew. Without the movement, he probably wouldn't have looked twice, but the box moved. Not from the wind, not from an animal that walked too close. It writhed as if there were something inside it. Something fighting. He froze halfway through his stride, and his heart beat loudly in his ears. His breath made little puffs in the cool air as he moved slowly forward. Then he heard it, a sound so gentle, so delicate, that it scarcely felt believable. A whimper. Ethan could feel the hair on his arms rising. His chest tightened. It wasn't just a sound. It was the sound of suffering. He swallowed hard and dropped to his knees beside the box. His hands paused above the flaps, caught between dread and urgency. Nothing made him angrier than to discover an injured or dying animal, discarded like rubbish. Gingerly, he pulled back the wet cardboard, and what he saw sent his stomach plummeting. Cramped in the corner of the box was a tiny, shivering puppy. Its fur was matted and dirty, strips of its skin inflamed from exposure. Its thin body revealed bones, its breathing shallow and faint. The unfortunate animal appeared to be dying. Ethan choked on the lump building in his throat. Who would do this? How could someone cast off a living soul like this? But then, something was not right. The puppy was tiny, almost unreasonably tiny for her breed. Its body appeared frail, but there was something in the way it stayed there, unmoving yet alert, that made Ethan feel like his skin was crawling. Then suddenly, the puppy's eyes popped open. For a moment, Ethan choked his breath back down his throat. The eyes that stared back at him were achingly intense, far too knowing, far too deep for such a young pup. And then came the real shock. The puppy, even if its body was weak, even if it was in a frail state, wasn't afraid. It was watching him, not like a frightened, lost dog, not like a being too weak to budge, but like it knew something. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had rescued dogs before, but this dog was different. And then, as if to validate his worst fears, the puppy emitted the oddest, most despairing whimper Ethan had ever heard. For a moment, Ethan was paralyzed. The tiny puppy lay curled in the cardboard box, its fragile body hardly rising and falling with each shallow breath. It was supposed to be weak, too weak to respond. And yet, its eyes. They weren't quaking with fear and desperation like Ethan had assumed. Instead, they were fixed on him with a disquieting fervor, like it was attempting to say something to him. It sent a shiver through him, but he quickly shook it off. This is just a puppy, just a small, vulnerable being with an empty stomach. There was no reason to be that nervous. And yet, something deep down inside him said, "You're wrong." Ethan took a deep breath and concentrated. The puppy needed help. That was all that mattered. He bent down without thinking and gently scooped the delicate creature into his palms. And then, the instant he picked it up, he dead stopped. Something wasn't right. The puppy hardly weighed anything, as insubstantial even as one so malnourished should have been. But that wasn't the thing that sent a chill racing up his spine. It was the way the puppy tensed the instant he touched it. Not like a frightened dog, not like something awaiting pain, but as if it were preparing for something. Ethan swallowed hard. His fingers felt alive as they ran through its fur. And that's when he noticed another thing. Its skin was cold. Too cold. Puppies were meant to be warm, their small bodies radiating warmth. But this one, it felt like it had been abandoned out in the cold for hours, if not days. Ethan felt a rush of urgency. So yes, he had to get this puppy to someplace warm, somewhere safe. But just as he was going to leave, he heard something that made his whole body tense. A sound, not from the puppy, providing instructions from behind the dumpster. A dim shuffle, as if something or someone was there. Ethan's heart pounded. He heard his instincts screaming, "You're not alone!" He turned his head slowly, eyes searching the darkness. Other than a distant hum of traffic, the alley was silent. Nothing moved, but Ethan knew better. Somebody dropped this puppy off here. Someone had abandoned it. And now, someone could be watching. He held the puppy in a tighter clutch, covering it with his body. His ears pounding with pulse, he took a step forward, then another. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, he looked back one last time. Nothing, but the sensation of being watched didn't go away. Ethan inhaled deeply, mentally willing himself to concentrate. He had to get the puppy home. That was all that mattered. He walked away, his mind reeling. The puppy was starving, freezing, and hardly alive. But there was still something wrong about it. Something he didn't know how to explain. And then, as if sensing his discomfort, the puppy did something that made Ethan's stomach sink. It made a noise, not a bark, not a whimper, but something so low, so unnatural that Ethan nearly dropped it in shock. His hands shook as he gazed down at the little being in his arms. For the first time since discovering the box, he wondered whether he had been wrong, because now he was no longer just concerned about saving the puppy's life. He was troubled by what or who had put it there to begin with, and why. Ethan's footsteps rang out against the deserted sidewalk, clutching the tiny, shaking puppy closer in his arms. The early sun was just beginning to rise, making long shadows on the otherwise still street. His apartment was only a few blocks away, but with each step, the weight in his chest got heavier. The sense of being watched had not gone away. If anything, it was stronger. He looked over his shoulder every few seconds. Nothing. No footsteps, no shadows lurking in the alleys, and yet a cold unease slithered down his spine. There was something wrong with this. The puppy hadn't made another sound since her strange, awful noise in the alley. Now it hung in his arms almost lifeless, except for an occasional convulsion going through its frail little body. Ethan quickened his pace. He didn't know why, but something in him was screaming, "Get home!" Now, by the time he opened the door to his apartment, his heart was pounding. He fumbled with his keys while stealing a look at the puppy. It still felt cold. Too cold. He crossed over the threshold, slamming the door behind him a bit harder than he needed to. As soon as he was in, he breathed a shaky sigh. Safe. Or at least, he hoped so. Ethan raced to the kitchen and placed the puppy on a fuzzy towel on the counter. He cranked up the heater, went into another room and grabbed a blanket, wrapping it around the little animal. It didn't react. No wagging tail, no sign of relief, just those same hauntingly deep eyes looking back at him. There was something about them that disturbed him. He shook the thought out of his head, picked up his phone, and hastily dialed his friend, a veterinarian named Dr. Sam Reynolds. The line rang and rang. Then, finally, "Hello?" Sam's voice was hoarse, still tinged with sleep. "Sam, it's Ethan. Sorry to call so early, but He hesitated, looked at the puppy. I found something. A puppy. It's not doing well." As Sam sat up, there was a rustle on the other end of the line. "Where did you find it?" "In an alley. Someone dumped it. But Sam, something's off." A pause. "Off how?" Ethan raked a hand through his hair. "I don't know. It's just weird. It does not weigh anything, but it is not a newborn. And it's ice cold. I don't know if it's sick or just—" Then suddenly, a soft noise. Not from the puppy, from the phone. Like another voice, just a whisper, tangled in static. Ethan pulled his phone from his ear, pulse racing. "Sam?" Silence. "Hello?" Then at last, Sam's voice came back. "Ethan, listen to me very carefully." Ethan's breath hitched. "Whatever you do, don't let it near any other animals. And don't—" The line went dead. Ethan stared at the screen as his chest tightened. What the hell was that? Before he had time to even process what had just happened, another sound filled the space. A low, near-human whimper. Ethan glanced toward the counter. The puppy was standing now. Weak, wobbly, but standing. And then, as though it were aware of his fear, it did something that made Ethan's gut sink. It tilted its little head and smiled. For an instant, Ethan lost the ability to breathe. Moments earlier, the puppy had been weak and starving, but was now standing on wobbly legs. Its small body still quivered, yet its bearing was different. And that smile, if you could even call it that, was off. Dogs don't smile like that. It wasn't a snarl. This was not a happy, panting grin. It was something else, something unnatural. Ethan's stomach churned, his fists clenched. His breaths were short, uneven. He blinked, and just like that, the smile was gone. The puppy crumpled to the towel, its brittle little body struggling to take in shallow breaths. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest as his eyes fixed on the delicate creature, his mind a flurry. Had he imagined it? Was he just exhausted? But way down deep inside him, he knew. This puppy was not quite right. Ethan paused his fingers above his phone. He needed to call Sam back. He had to learn what the vet was trying to tell him. But just before he could dial, another sound filled the room. Scratching, software rhythmic, coming from the counter. Ethan felt his heart rate kick up again as he turned back to the towel. The puppy's small feet were not just flailing, not panicking, but purposeful. It was scratching the towel in little incremental movements. At first, it made no sense. But then, Ethan realized it was writing something, a pattern, a symbol. Ethan's throat went dry. The scratches were faint and barely made an impression on the fabric, but they were also rhythmic, like the puppy was trying to communicate. He didn't know a lot about symbols or codes, but this seemed wrong, too deliberate, too precise. He reached out slowly, running his fingers over the scratches. The moment he touched them, the puppy opened her eyes wide. A low, guttural sound climbed up from its throat. Ethan recoiled, all but overturning a chair. His breath hitched. This isn't normal. This isn't right. For a long, tense moment, the puppy simply stared up at him, its tiny chest rising and falling too slowly. Then, as abruptly as before, its whole body went slack. A stifling silence descended upon the room. Ethan fumbled for his phone, redialing Sam's number in a panic. It rang, and rang, and rang. No answer. Ethan muttered an expletive under his breath. He needed answers. Now, he snatched his jacket, then wrapped the tiny puppy in the towel and bolted to the door. He didn't care how early in the morning it was. He was going to Sam's clinic, because whatever was going on with this puppy wasn't natural, and rightly he was terrified to discover why. Ethan's palms were sweaty on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. The puppy was swaddled in a heavy towel on the passenger seat, its tiny rib cage barely rising and falling. The streets were hauntingly void of traffic and people. What he could hear outside was a silence that mirrored the unsettling quiet of the interior of the car. He had attempted to call Sam again. No answer. His instinct told him something was amiss, and now he faced a choice to make. Take the puppy to a second vet, or go directly to Sam's house? His instincts ordered him to go to Sam, because this was not something a regular vet could deal with. The dimly lit streets he was driving through made little difference as he pressed the gas pedal, his heart racing. A few minutes later, Ethan arrived at Sam's house. It was a small, single-story house on the outskirts of town. The porch light was off. No movement inside. He hesitated. Sam was a fall-out-of-bed early riser. Why wasn't he picking up his phone? Something wasn't adding up. Tuning out his doubts, he lifted out the towel-wrapped puppy and opened the car door. The atmosphere was tense, like the minute before a storm. As he neared the door, a shadow flicked across the window. Ethan froze. Someone was inside. His pulse quickened. He rapped on the door, 1, 2 times. Silence. Then, "Kriak." As the door opened slowly, there was a dimly lit corridor. Something felt off. The air inside was thick with the smell of coffee and something else. Something metallic. Ethan's hold on the puppy tightened as he stepped inside. Sam. No answer. He looked around the living room. There were papers all over the coffee table. A mug was on its side, coffee oozing onto the floor. And then, a noise from the hallway. A faint shuffling sound. Ethan's throat tightened. He moved forward toward the noise, his heart pounding in his chest. The light in the hallway flashed, creating odd shapes against the walls. And then, he saw it. A corpse lay on the ground near the door to the study. Sam! Ethan sprinted forward, heart in his throat. Sam was still breathing, sort of. His shirt soaked in sweat, his face white. His fingers were closed around something, a crumpled piece of paper. Ethan dropped to his knee next to him, shaking his shoulder. "Sam! Hey, wake up!" Sam's eyes fluttered open. He appeared dazed, bewildered, frightened. "Ethan!" His voice was hoarse. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Sam's gaze turned toward the towel in Ethan's arms. The puppy. His entire body tensed. "Ethan!" His voice came out almost a whisper. "You need to get rid of it. Now." Ethan's blood ran cold. What are you talking about?" Sam had a hard time sitting up and winced when he did. He gestured weakly at the desk. "The files. Read them." Ethan paused and made a tentative placement of the puppy on a chair. He dashed toward the desk and grabbed the stack of papers. His eyes moved over the pages, old veterinary reports, yellowed newspaper clippings, medical studies. And then he saw it. A photo. A black and white photo of a dog, small, frail, uncannily like the one he had discovered. The caption below it made his stomach drop. Subject 17. Presumed dead. Experiment terminated. Ethan couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he turned to look at the little being peacefully lying on his chair. Sam's voice now barely reached him. "Ethan, that thing, it was never meant to exist." Ethan was breathing shallowly, clutching the faded photograph with shaking hands. Subject 17. Presumed dead. Experiment terminated. They were words heavy enough to press down on his chest like a weight, as if they were something he could not shake. He looked back at Sam, who still appeared to be weak, barely sitting up. His face had turned white, his brow slicked with sweat. But his eyes were open wide with something much worse than exhaustion. Fear. Ethan swallowed hard. Sam, what the hell is this? Sam squeezed his eyes shut for a moment as if to collect himself before speaking. Then his voice emerged low and hoarse. It's a mistake, Ethan. Ethan's stomach twisted. What do you mean? Sam's hand balled into a fist, breath coming hard. That puppy, it's not supposed to be here. Ethan shook his head. That doesn't make any sense. I found it in a box, Sam. They dumped it like trash. Sam laughed in dry disbelief. Because that's precisely what it is, Ethan. Garbage. A failed experiment. The walls of the room were closing in. Ethan's mind raced. Experiment? You're not making sense, man. Sam coughed and gestured weakly at the papers. Read. Page 3. Ethan frowned, then rifled through the stack of documents until he came to the page Sam had mentioned. His eyes raced over the yellowing paper. The headline gave him the shivers. Genitalisensing, the remastization team. He prayed as he glanced at the document, his stomach churning. It described a series of experimental procedures performed in a private laboratory nearly 20 years ago. The research was designed to create a new breed of canine, one tougher, more resilient, more cognitive than all before. But the annotations below the report offered another narrative. Subjects showed erratic behaviors, neurologic abnormalities identified. Experiment stopped after several deaths. It felt as if the floor had fallen away from the bottom of Ethan. This is a joke of some sort, right? Sam shook his head. I wish it was. Ethan's mouth went dry. What happened to them? A trembling, long exhale escaped Sam. The project was shut down. They were all destroyed. Ethan's eyes flicked back to the photo, the puppy in the image. It was just like the one he had discovered. Sam. Ethan's voice was low, barely a whisper. So, you're saying this puppy is one of them? Sam hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. A chill wave of dread washed over Ethan. That meant this fragile-looking thing lying on his chair was supposed to be dead. It wasn't just a stray. It wasn't just abandoned. Someone had attempted to snuff it out of existence. And now, it was here, with him. A loud crashing noise broke the silence. A low growl. Ethan's breath caught. Gradually, he turned in the direction of the chair where the puppy rested. Except that now it wasn't lying down. It was sitting there, facing him, staring. But its eyes, they were different. No longer wide and innocent. They were sharp, too aware. A low growl emanated from its minuscule frame, but it didn't sound like a puppy. It sounded deep, distorted, wrong. Sam sucked in a breath. Ethan, don't move. Ethan's entire body tensed. The puppy's head tilted. Its eyes were trained on him. Its breathing had slowed. It was watching, calculating. Then, in a motion too swift for something so sickly, it jumped, directly at Ethan's chest. Ethan had little time to react. The small body hurtled through the air, far too fast, far too accurate for something so voiceless. Instinct took over. He ducked. The puppy flew over his head, slamming into the bookshelf behind him. The books fell to the floor, but before Ethan could even grasp what had just occurred, that creature was already on its feet again. No whimper, no sign of pain, only those cold, calculating eyes boring into him. Ethan gasped in interrupted breaths. This wasn't a puppy, it looked like one. It acted like one. But inside, Ethan knew this was different. The man was trying to rise from the floor, his face wrenched in agony. Ethan, listen to me. His voice sounded urgent, strained. You've got to get it out of here now. Ethan clenched his fists. And go where, Sam? You're acting like I can just go to a shelter and drop this off." Sam shook his head, wincing. "You don't get it." He extended a shaking finger toward the creature. "It's not just dangerous, it's—" The puppy moved. Fast. It was standing across the room, and then suddenly it was gone. The next, it was on the couch, just inches from Ethan's arm. His body tensed. The air hung heavy, thick with something that Ethan couldn't quite name. His instincts told him to run, to fight, to do something. But then, the puppy stopped. Its ears twitched. It made to turn its head toward the window. A moment passed, then another, and then it bolted. Not toward Ethan, not toward Sam, but toward the window. Crash! A glass panel shattered as the tiny body burst through, plunging into the dark morning outside. Neither Ethan nor Sam moved for a second. Then, Sam let out a shaky breath. "It's gone." Ethan was still looking at the broken window. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. What the hell just happened? Sam brushed a hand across his face, fingers shaking. "It ran." Ethan looked over at him with a tense jaw. "Yeah, I got that part. But why?" Sam's face darkened. He looked at the broken glass. Because Ethan, his voice had dropped to a whisper. Something else frightened it off. A shiver coursed down Ethan's spine. Something else? Something worse? Just as he opened his mouth to ask, Sam made himself stand. He seized Ethan's arm, clasping it harder than he should have been able to in his weakened condition. "Listen to me," he said. "That thing, it wasn't alone." Ethan's breath hitched. Sam's jaw tightened. There were others, more of them. And if this one is alive... His grip tightened. It means the others could be as well. Ethan saw that the words settled on his chest like a weight. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. And there was something out there coming for them. The room was dead silent. It was as silent as being alone in the desert. Just the sound of the wind moaning through the broken window. The heat of adrenaline still coursed through Ethan's veins. His breath came unevenly. His muscles were tight. That thing, the puppy, it had attacked him. And then it had run. Not out of fear of him, because it was scared of something else. Ethan glanced over at Sam, his jaw tight. "You're telling me there are more of these things?" Sam exhaled sharply, nodding. His cheek was still pale, but now there was a certainty in his eyes. "Long ago, the lab sought to eliminate them, but we never found them all." Ethan's chest tightened. "And you suppose this one, this Subject 17, was one of the survivors?" After a moment, Sam nodded. Slowly and unwillingly, "Yes. And if it's alive, then maybe the others are too." A chilly weight dropped into Ethan's stomach. The puppy was hardly an outlier. It was in service of a greater thing, something that had not been buried in the past, as they had believed. Ethan ran a hand through his hair and tried to make sense of all of this. "Okay, let's assume you're right. That means that someone, or something, kept them alive all this time." Sam's gaze darkened. Or they adapted. Ethan's blood ran cold. Adapted? Sam swallowed hard, rubbing his temples. "Ethan, these weren't some augmented dogs. These objects had a specific purpose. Something experimental. They weren't only physically modified." Ethan's throat felt dry. "What do you mean?" Sam locked eyes with him, his expression grim. They were supposed to be about smarter than regular dogs. A thick silence hung between them. The realization seeped into Ethan's mind like a slow-burning fuse. That puppy, its gaze, the way it watched him, the way it smiled. It wasn't just an animal. It was thinking, planning. Ethan's pulse hammered. "So you're telling me that we just released a genetically enhanced, perhaps hyper-intelligent predator into the city. Sam swallowed hard. Yeah, Ethan cursed softly. Then, as if on cue, his phone rang. The sudden noise startled both men. Ethan pulled the phone out of his pocket, heart racing as he recognized the number. Unknown caller. He hesitated. Then he answered carefully. Hello? For a moment, there was nothing. Just silence. Then, a voice, low, hollow, and terribly distorted. You should not have taken it. Ethan's blood turned to ice. The voice was not human, as if it was having difficulty forming words properly. He swallowed hard and made himself say, Who is this? A pause. Then a laggardly, alien sound crackled out of the speaker. It took Ethan a moment to register it was breathing. Then, in a tone that sent a deep chill down his spine, It's looking for you now. The call cut off. Ethan gazed at his phone, feeling at once cold in his hands. Sam's voice was little more than a whisper. Who was that? Ethan tightened his grip on the phone. I don't know. His mind raced. Someone knew about the puppy. And now, it was hunting him. He looked at Sam, his jaw clenched. We need to find it, before it finds us. Because if they didn't, what would follow would be so much worse. Ethan gripped the phone hard. The distorted voice echoed in his ears as his heart raced in his chest. It's looking for you now. The words were like a warning, a threat, or worse, a promise. Sam stood paralyzed next to him, his face drained of color. Ethan, we have to get out of here. Ethan's jaw tensed. His mind raced. Number running won't help. If Subject 17 is hunting us, we need to get ahead of it. Sam paused, then nodded hesitantly. Then we need to track it. Fast. Ethan's stomach churned. The beast had gone into the city. By now, it could be anywhere. But it was looking for him, which meant that, no doubt, things would get more clear. The silence that followed was heavy. The wind screamed against the broken window outside, a ghostly chill filtering through the house. Then, a noise, software subtle, but there. Ethan stiffened. Sam's eyes widened. Did you hear that? Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes flying to the doorway. The lights in the living room flickered. And then, a shadow moved. Not from the broken glass, not from the wind, from something outside, something watching them. Ethan felt it before he saw it, that deep gut instinct of dread creeping up his spine. Sam groped around on the desk, his old hunting knife. His fingers trembled. Ethan, he whispered, we are not alone. Ethan stepped carefully forward, eyes scanning the darkened corridor. His heart thundered in his ears, and then he saw it. Through the shattered window, a pair of glowing eyes, watching, waiting. Ethan's blood ran cold. It was only when she mentioned Subject 17 at first. But then, as his eyes adjusted to the dark, he noticed something far worse. The eyes were too elevated off the dirt, too large, too many. Ethan counted 4, number 6, 8. His breath hitched. There's more than one, he said in a whisper. Sam's face went ashen. Oh, God. The luminous eyes didn't blink. They didn't move, just watched, studying, calculating. Then, a low, guttural growl, not from one, from all of them. The air was thick, charged with something Ethan couldn't name. Then, a single step. A figure stepped forward. Ethan's breath caught. Now he could see its silhouette. This one was like Subject 17, only bigger, stronger. Its head drooped, its spine curving slightly. And the worst part? It wasn't attacking, it was waiting. Ethan's skin crawled. Sam, he whispered, we need to crash. The front door burst open. Too quick to react, a dark blur darted past. Ethan had just begun to turn when something struck him forcefully, pushing him backward. He slammed into the coffee table, his ribs flaring into pain. Sam shouted. Ethan struggled to catch his breath, his vision blurring. And then, over the ringing in his ears, he heard it. A voice. Distorted. Twisted. But it wasn't coming from a phone this time. It was coming from inside the room. You shouldn't have taken it. Ethan's eyes focused, just as the black shape stood up over him. And then, everything went black. Darkness. Ethan felt like his mind was suspended in an empty void. There was no sound, no feeling, just cold, endless nothingness. Then, a voice, distant, warped, calling his name. "Ethan, wake up!" A sharp ringing cut at his ears, pulling him from the abyss. His muscles were sore, lungs on fire, and the air around felt wrong. After some time, his eyes opened slowly, and what he saw chilled him to the bone. He was no longer at Sam's house, no shattered window, no overturned furniture, just darkness. Above him, a faint fluorescent light hummed dully, casting skinny shadows over the cold, damp concrete floor. His wrists ached. When he attempted to move, a stabbing pain shot up his arms. That's when he realized he was tied to a chair. Fear rippled through his torso. He gasped for breath, uneven, and pulled at the restraints, but they held firm. "Sam?" His voice was hoarse, breaking from dry air. "Hello?" Silence. Then, a shuffle in the dark. Ethan's muscles tensed. Heartbeat hammered against his ribs. He wasn't alone. A shadow flickered just out of reach of the dim glow of the light. Slow, controlled. Then one voice, low and unnatural. "You should not have had it." The same voice as the one around the phone. But this time, it was closer. Ethan's breath hitched. His mind raced. Who, what, was speaking? The figure moved closer, stepping into the feeble light. Ethan stood shocked, frozen up and down. It was a man, or something that appeared to be one. Lanky, haggard, wearing a worn black coat. His skin was sickly pale and stretched too tight across his sharp features. But his eyes, they weren't human. They were just like Subject 17's, glowing, hollow, wrong. Ethan's stomach churned. What are you?" he whispered. The man cocked his head, watching him. Then, in a voice that hollowed Ethan's bones, "You were not meant to ever find it." Ethan swallowed hard. All it was the puppy. "Subject 17, what is it?" The man exhaled slowly. Not a mistake, not an accident. His luminous eyes appeared to incinerate Ethan's spirit. An evolution. Ethan's chest tightened. "What does that mean?" he demanded. The man stepped closer still. "Project Novus was never simply about enhancement," he said. "It was about making something new, something better." Ethan shook his head. "Better?" His voice dripped disbelief. "That thing attacked me. It was testing you." Ethan's breath caught. The man stepped slowly forward again. "They don't fear you, you see, Ethan, but they are curious." A chill realization lodged itself in Ethan's chest. "They are thinking," the man went on. "They learn. They adapt." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Then why did it run?" The man's lips twisted into a half-smile. "Because it felt something bigger." Ethan's pulse pounded. "Something greater?" The man nodded. "It knew, just as I know." A long silence extended between them. Then the man's expression turned dark. "You are in their way." Ethan's blood ran cold. He felt a sudden piercing pain in his temple. His vision blurred. The room spun. His body collapsed forward. And the last thing he heard as darkness overcame him once more. "Now they are coming." Ethan's ears were ringing sharply. His head throbbed. He felt heavy, weighed down like he was sinking into the floor. He fought to open his eyes, but everything was mottled, a haze of flickering light and gliding shadows. Slowly, his vision cleared. He was still in the same room, still tied to the chair. But something had changed. The pale man was gone, and the air felt different, thicker, colder, like something unseen was observing him. Ethan's breath came in quick, uneven bursts while his mind raced. Now they are coming. That was the last thing the pale man had told him before he lost consciousness. Who was coming? And more importantly, why? There was a faint click that reverberated through the room. Ethan's muscles tensed. The door on the other side of him unlocked. For a long moment, it did nothing. Then, it slowly creaked open. Ethan's heart was racing as he peered down the dark corridor beyond. No footsteps, no movement, just a long, blank corridor leading into the void. His instincts were screaming at him. Move! Now. Through gritted teeth, Ethan pulled at his fetters. The ropes were looser this time, as though someone had intentionally made it so he could escape. Then the ropes finally broke with one last sharp pull. Ethan didn't hesitate. He got to his feet, muscles on fire as he made his way toward the open door. The hallway beyond was narrow, its single overhead light flickering weakly. Metal doors lined the walls, each with a small rectangular window clouded with grime. Ethan's skin prickled. This place, it wasn't some derelict building, it was a facility, and whatever had been stored here wasn't human. Ethan stepped soundlessly over the cold concrete floor. As he approached the first door, he paused, then looked through the grime-covered glass. His stomach twisted. The room beyond was a cell. On the inside were deep claw marks on the walls, as if something had tried, desperately, to escape. A little rusted tag dangled next to the doorframe. Subject 09, terminated. Ethan's breath hitched. The following door had a second tag. Subject 12, terminated. Then another. Subject 15, terminated. All the way down the hall. And then Ethan stopped cold. The last door at the end of the hall had an alternate tag. Not rusted, not covered in dust, fresh. Subject 17, active. Ethan's chest tightened. He hesitated, fingers hovering above the handle. Then, a low, distorted growl reverberated through the air. Ethan's blood ran cold. It was coming from behind the door. Slowly, he took a step back. The growling grew louder. Then, bang! The door shook violently. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. Whatever lay beyond that door, it wasn't locked in anymore. Another bang. And then, the lights cut out. Total darkness. Ethan swallowed hard, catching his breath. And then, in the silence, a whisper. Close, too close. Run! The whisper sent a chill down Ethan to the bone. Run! But he couldn't. Not yet. Not without knowing what lay behind that door. His breathing grew shallow, and he stepped back again. The dark was an entity of its own, devouring every footfall of the cramped passageway. Then, a sound. A slow, deliberate click. Ethan's stomach dropped. The lock on Subject 17's door had finally clicked open. There was a heavy silence in the air. His pulse pulsated in his ears. Then, the door creaked open. From the darkness outside came a low growl, not deep, not loud, controlled, calculated. Ethan's body froze in place as something moved ahead. First, just a shadow, then 2 glowing eyes. Not wild, not rabid, intelligent, watching, studying. Ethan swallowed hard. He could hardly see its shape in the darkness, but he didn't need to see much. It was bigger now, not the little, fragile puppy he had discovered in the alley. Now this was something else, something unnatural. It tilted its head just as eerily as before. Ethan staggered backward. The instinct to move shouted at him, to run, but his body refused to obey. Then it spoke. A voice, twisted and diverse, slithering through the air. "You took me from them." Ethan's blood ran cold. It wasn't just an experiment. It was aware. And it was angry. A sudden blur. It moved, too fast. Ethan hardly had time to react before it was on him, slamming him against the concrete wall. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. He lived with pain shooting through his ribs as he resisted his efforts to shove it off. But its strength was inhuman. The creature drew closer, its breath icy against his skin. "You weren't supposed to find me." Its voice rolled over the air, half growl, half human. Ethan's chest heaved. His mind raced. He couldn't overpower it. He couldn't outrun it. But perhaps he could talk it down. He choked out words through the pain. I wasn't trying to hurt you." Silence. The creature didn't move. Its luminous eyes were fixed on him as though it were contemplating. Then it sniffed the air. Its pupils dilated. Ethan hardly had time to respond before it let him go and took off, directly down the hall. Ethan wheezed and grabbed at his ribs. What the hell just happened? Then he heard it. Another sound, coming from the hallway. Not a growl, not a whisper, a footstep, and then another. Someone else was here. Ethan's stomach knotted. Who? Or worse, what? He faced the darkness, and then he saw it. A new set of glowing eyes. Not just one pair, not just two. Dozens. Ethan's breath hitched. It hit him like a freight train. Subject 17 wasn't escaping. It was joining them. And Ethan. And he was right in the center of all of them. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The shadowy space around him was no longer empty. It was filled with eyes. Dozens of them. Glowing, unblinking, watching. A chill wave of dread crawled up his spine as the realization sunk in. He was surrounded. Subject 17 was no accident. It wasn't alone. And now they were here. Ethan's heart thumped against his ribs. His body was screaming at him to run, but he knew there was nowhere to go. A muted, collective growl echoed through the dark. Then they moved. Not in chaos, not in a frenzy, in unison. Ethan backed away, leaning against the damp concrete wall. His heart raced, his pulse throbbing in his ears. This was not normal animal behavior. This was organized, calculated. They weren't just a pack, they were a unit. And they were waiting for something. Ethan swallowed hard. His throat was dry, his hands trembled. Then a shape stepped forward, larger than the others, more controlled. Its fiery eyes pierced through his. Subject 17. Ethan's chest tightened. The creature's posture had changed. No more weak, no more frail. It had grown, which challenged him in ways other than physically. Something much more frightening. Ethan's heart raced as Subject 17 moved another step closer. And then it spoke. Not through growls, not through snarls, through words. "You shouldn't have pulled me out of the dark." Ethan's blood ran cold. The other creatures moved forward, not attacking, just surrounding. Boxing him in, he could feel them now, the weight of their presence, the pressure in the air. Then a whisper. But it wasn't spoken aloud. It was inside his head. "You don't belong here." Ethan's legs buckled. His vision went dark for a moment. Then another voice, his own voice. "Run!" But he couldn't. Because now he finally realized. It wasn't only about genetic experiments. This wasn't merely about a rogue lab project gone awry. These creatures, they were changing. And now they had plans. A new sound filled the air. Not a growl, not a voice. A signal. Low, humming, pulsing, like a command. And then the swarm moved, straight toward him. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest. He had seconds to act, just before he became fully engulfed. There was only one way out, and it was going to hurt. He gritted his teeth, braced his resolve, and then he ran. Straight into the darkness, straight towards the unknown. Ethan ran. The air was scorching in his lungs, his legs a chorus of protest as he raced down the pitch-black hallways of the facility. Behind him, they were coming, fast, silent. Not as a crazed pack of animals, but as an organized group. A hunt. The low, pulsing hum remained in his skull, vibrating through his bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a command. And he knew it wasn't getting for him. It was for them, Subject 17 and its kind. Join the 181,316 others signed up to receive the novelties, product updates, and offers from Al Jazeera. That had survived anyway. Ethan's heart slammed against the inside of his ribs as he rounded a sharp corner, nearly losing his grip. He didn't know where he was headed. Don't know if there's a way out of this place. But he couldn't stop. Stopping meant death. Or worse. A flash of light ahead, sudden. Ethan's eyes widened. A door. An exit sign dimly illuminated above. His last chance. His only chance. In one last effort, he propelled himself forward, crashing into the heavy metal door. It didn't budge. No, no, no. Ethan struggled to catch his breath. His hands scrambled for the handle, pulling with all the force he'd left in him. Still nothing. His stomach dropped. It was locked. And then the growling stopped. Ethan's blood ran cold. Slowly, he turned. The hallway was no longer deserted. They were here. In the darkness, rows of glowing eyes were glinting, watching, waiting. The thing that called itself Subject 17 moved forward with unnatural fluidity, not a mindless predator. Something else, something more. It looked at him, its gaze inscrutable. Then, finally, it spoke. You didn't understand, did you? Ethan's pulse pounded. The creature stepped even closer. You think you found me? A low chuckle rumbled from its throat. Almost human. But I found you. Ethan's breath hitched. A terrible realization lodged itself in his chest like a stone. It was more than a matter of survival. It wasn't just about escape. They had lured him here. From the very beginning, the box in the alley, the abandoned facility, the whispers in the dark, all of it. Not an accident, not a mistake, a trap. Ethan took a shaky step back. His back slammed against the door, the last way out reduced to a dead end. Subject 17's lips twisted past a mere smile. The others, they weren't strong enough, but you survived. Ethan's mind reeled. This wasn't about assassinating him. It was about testing him. They had been watching, waiting, and now they had discovered what they came for. His stomach twisted. You, what do you want from me? Subject 17 tilted its head. To understand you. Ethan's pulse came back heightened, the vibrations rocking him. The creatures were drawing nearer, closing in, their shapes blending into the darkness, their strides smooth and in sync, like a single entity, like a hive, and Ethan, he was the final piece. His breath shook. There was no way out, no escaping this, because he wasn't merely an observer of their evolution, he was a part of it now. Subject 17's voice rang in the silence. Welcome home, Ethan. The lights flickered. The shadows closed in. And then, everything went dark.